Zelda and I have a complicated relationship. The Legend of Zelda was the earliest video game series that I can remember getting into, and I've had many enjoyable experiences over the years with these games that help cultivate my love of puzzle solving, light fantastical drama, and, as I'll be discussing quite a bit going forward, the relentless pursuit of 100% completion. While I won't pretend that I look back fondly on every Zelda game, for the most part this franchise stood out as one of my favorites for a very long time. And then Breath of the Wild happened. I didn't hate Breath of the Wild. I played through it all, completed every shrine and found every Korok seed, and even stuck around long enough to finish the DLC, but it was exhausting. Speaking as a completionist, the open world format can easily become an overwhelming one, with the prospect of a game setting you loose to do whatever you want in any order you want being terrifying rather than liberating, because there's no structure to follow apart from one you impose on it yourself. And when there's this much to collect, and very little in the way of logical ways to break down content into smaller chunks for easier organization, it quickly stops being fun, at least for me. I'm aware, of course, that there are people who do 100% speedruns of these types of games, and that surely they must work off giant lists of optimal pathing to do what they do. But that is a daunting prospect, especially when exploiting the game's physics engines in all sorts of weird ways for optimized sequence breaking isn't all that appealing to me either. The long and short of it, sadly, was that I never revisited Breath of the Wild after my first full playthrough. And then, when Tears of the Kingdom came out, I skipped it entirely. The first time in my life I'd ever decided not to get a mainline Zelda game. As I saw it, Tears of the Kingdom was just more of what had exhausted me about its predecessor and then some, and I just couldn't bring myself to get invested in something like that. I quietly resigned myself to the fact that 3D Zelda wasn't interesting to me anymore, and that from here on out, I'd probably only enjoy the series via remakes and possibly through new 2D outings. I adore the Link's Awakening remake, which updates a familiar classic with a delightful visual style and assorted quality of life features. And going back a little further, I really enjoy A Link Between Worlds for kind of doing something similar with A Link to the Past, and arguably even surpassing that game in overall quality, which is especially strange for me to say as that was my first Zelda game. But looking at the pre-release marketing for Echoes of Wisdom, I can't say that it was really doing much for me either. The reuse of assets from Link's Awakening was a nice stylistic touch, and there was the hope that the limits of 2D would rein in some of the open-world excess that defines current 3D Zelda. But the Echo mechanic reminded me quite a bit of the Ultra Hand shenanigans touted as the central feature of Tears of the Kingdom, and I worried that the developers were going to pull out all the stops to translate that same kind of non-linear, build-your-own-adventure mentality into even these smaller-scale, top-down Zelda games. Echoes of Wisdom's truly unique selling point, that it finally gives the series' title character the full playable protagonist treatment, barely even registered to me. As refreshing of a premise as that may be, how could I enjoy it if I was going to be so turned off by the gameplay? But that is why I am so very pleased to report that the gameplay of Echoes of Wisdom is, in fact, good, retaining a certain classic Zelda feel while sprinkling in just enough of the design philosophy of the modern 3D games to reach a happy medium between the two. At least in my opinion. I could understand the counterpoint that Echoes of Wisdom tries so hard to walk that fine line that it ends up being mildly dissatisfying no matter which experience you prefer. Even from a perspective completely opposite of my own, that of players who love freeform open-world gameplay and want as few restrictions as possible, I can see a few points where Echoes of Wisdom would be frustrating. For instance, the strongest combat echo, the Lynel, can be obtained very early on if you know where to look for it. However, because of the limitations placed on echo summon cost, you won't actually be able to use the Lynel until you're roughly 3/4 of the way through the story. And there's no way to get around that. This is very much not the kind of game where you can run straight from the starting area to the final boss and beat it with enough knowledge and skill. And that's because Echoes of Wisdom does come with quite a few narrative stopgaps that break up its action. It's arguably even more linear than A Link Between Worlds, which has a much smaller map with overall less to do, but on the other hand sets you loose in Low after the halfway point with the freedom to tackle its 7 main dungeons in just about any order. Echoes of Wisdom, at its most open, only gives you a choice of 3, and even then there's a fairly logical optimal order for doing those temples that isn't likely to encourage players to experiment with variation. Personally, I adore these design choices because of how much easier it is to divide up the business of doing and collecting everything there is in this game. Additionally, it allows for smoother narrative progression than what you see in the recent 3D Zeldas. I'm not going to pretend like there's anything groundbreaking on display here, but there's a handful of moments here and there that stood out. Most of them, admittedly, come in the game's back half, which not only ramps up the stakes by finally introducing its actual antagonist, but also showcases more overall variety in the character types it's playing with. Of course, everyone adores Conde, the childlike Yeti tragically left all alone on a mountain waiting patiently for the return of his beloved older brother. But I have to give a nod here as well to the Dekus, which I wasn't expecting to say because prior to Echoes of Wisdom, I'm not sure I ever really thought twice about these quirky little wooden guys. They're exclusionary trendsetters who live in a swamp and insult tourists while displaying remarkably little concern for their own well-being, and also eating stuff that would gross out people with less refined palates. It's like a little taste of New Orleans right here in Hyrule. Oh, and they also use they-them pronouns in this game, which is a cute touch considering we're talking about a race of sapient plants, and allows them to join the Gerudo and the Gorons in the club of Zelda races with unconventional takes on gender. Good for them. The Dekus even get the best dungeon in the game, the one that feels most appropriately labyrinthine, and incorporates a variety of thematic elements from electricity to poisonous jungle plants, to underwater segments, to automated Armos Knights, to, spiders. Didn't think I'd ever be praising a swamp dungeon in a Zelda game, but here we are. And I haven't even gotten to the princess herself yet. Zelda, sadly, is a bit of a letdown in the characterization department in Echoes of Wisdom. This is largely on account of the developers sticking her in the silent protagonist role for no apparent reason, even though Link is also silent and actually comes with an in-universe explanation for why he doesn't speak this time. This gets especially ridiculous when the two of them formally meet near the end of the game, and sidekick character Tri has to provide all the dialogue and exposition you'd expect them to just talk about between themselves. But even so, playing as Zelda nonetheless provides a narratively distinct experience in its own way, especially in the second half of the game where she's no longer traveling around Hyrule in disguise. Link's had friends and family in past games, but he's never had anything like Zelda's vast support network of helpful allies and loved ones already built up from the beginning of the game. Kinda makes you wonder why she's still being charged full price at shops, and not given any slack in the many frustrating minigames found in this version of Hyrule, but she's an egalitarian-minded princess, I suppose. The horse races in Echoes of Wisdom are just miserable, and I'm saying that as a completionist, so you know minigames are the bane of my Zelda playing existence. But what really sets the princess apart are, of course, the Echoes, and how drastically they alter everything from combat to world traversal. There are 127 Echoes in the game, and naturally with a list that long, some are going to be amazing general-purpose summons, some are going to be valuable in particular situations, some are going to be rarely used but really appreciated when you need them, and the rest are just kind of there to pad out the roster. I don't consider that a problem per se, especially because it's not always going to be immediately obvious which Echoes can break many of the game's challenges in half. There's around 5 or 6 that can trivialize most platforming segments, which is significant because that element is arguably more prominent in Echoes of Wisdom than in any other 2D Zelda, but it still takes some doing to learn how to use stuff like the flying tile and the water block as effectively as possible. Ditto the combat-focused Echoes. Of course, the Lionel is as good as it gets, but as I mentioned earlier, you're not going to get to use that one for most of the game, meaning that until that point you'll be experimenting with other options. And even then, there are still certain Echoes that will be more useful than the Lionel against certain targets. Echoes are a thoughtfully designed mechanic from just about every angle, allowing for variance in how players interact with the world, and also giving people like me a sort of gotta-catch-em-all feeling in tracking down and collecting every Echo out there. Even the ones that are basically useless. It's not like that's not also a thing in Pokemon, right? And beyond that, echoes also fundamentally alter how you're likely to approach combat encounters compared to other Zelda games, which is perfectly demonstrated by the sword fighter form. While I've seen complaints that this mechanic essentially invalidates the developer's efforts at giving Zelda a unique skill set, because in most cases it's just faster to mow things down with a sword or a bow than it is to bother with summons, I don't really see it that way. The energy bar restricts how long you can be in sword fighter form, unless you load up on energy restoring smoothies, of course, and so you really are forced to think about combat in a different way much of the time. Often, I found myself avoiding fights whenever I could help it, or otherwise playing around with different echoes and the ever-versatile bind ability to take care of enemies so I could save sword fighter form for the times where it was really needed. I don't consider this more passive approach to combat to be necessarily a flaw. If anything, I thought it was both funny and weirdly appropriate when you get to the final boss and are cast in the support role for an AI-controlled Link, because that's what Zelda has historically done in these fights. As someone who prefers to play support in my rare excursions into MMORPGs, I actually appreciated having fights where I wasn't expected to be DPS for a change. And really, the Null fight is pretty emblematic of the experience of Echoes of Wisdom as a whole, where markedly distinct mechanics are overlaid onto very familiar territory for this series. It's easy to pick out little nods to past games all over the place, from Twilight Princess to Link's Awakening to Ocarina of Time, and so on. Even the introduction of a completely new antagonist with massive existential implications still ultimately boils down to the same old routine of the Triforce getting split up and the villain getting left with only one of the pieces, which, as it happens, A Link Between Worlds already did anyway. That's not even mentioning what I consider to be the game's most clever callback, that its world map is an expansion of the one from A Link to the Past with numerous direct references in its geography. Let's be honest here, we're all Nintendo fans, and nostalgia bait is this company's bread and butter, so I absolutely do not intend this as a criticism. Echoes of Wisdom might be one of the most mechanically distinct mainline Zeldas alongside the adventure of Link going full-on action game, and Breath of the Wild and its sequel going all in on the open world and dynamic physics engine concepts. But it still feels right at home. Cozy, one might say. To be able to revisit a Hyrule under vastly different circumstances that nonetheless feels like another solid iteration of the 2D classics. Naturally, there are problems, most of which have been outlined thoroughly by others already, like the clunky UI and the soundtrack that's average at best and the mediocre dungeons. But funnily enough, I've heard all three of those as common critiques of Breath of the Wild and/or Tears of the Kingdom, so apparently that's just par for the course in modern Zelda. Being one of those weirdos who actually likes water dungeons, I especially have to express my disappointment over Jabul Ruins, which squanders its clever opening and early preview of the boss with a water spout elevator idea that doesn't even really qualify as a puzzle at any point. I'm glad that Lanayru, and even more so Pharaon Temples, came in to pick up the slack somewhat later on, but I fully admit that even they aren't the best the series has to offer. This is all to say, though, that Echoes of Wisdom captures the spirit of classic Zelda while also integrating elements of the open-world games in such a way that those concepts coexist more or less peacefully. That it does so while placing Zelda herself in the starring role for the first time ever, because we don't talk about the CDI games, is even more of a marvel, and more of a reason why I find this game to be so fascinating in its own way. I gladly played through Echoes of Wisdom twice in making this video, going for 100% completion both times, because minus the series' typical nuisances in that department, I had a lot of fun doing so. This might sound like a criticism, or at least a very odd way of looking at these games, but one of my favorite things about Zelda is getting to compile everything there is to obtain in each game into a big list which I can then break down and optimize for a directed experience of my own creation. I realize that's contrary to how many reviewers of this series will praise the thrill of exploring the unknown and making your own discoveries, but what can I say? I like my spreadsheets and bullet points, and Echoes of Wisdom is fully manageable in that way, while still maintaining enough non-linearity to allow you to shake up the order of things on subsequent playthroughs. That's basically the best of both worlds, and presumably what the developers were aiming for. But what did you think of Echoes of Wisdom? How does it measure up in your opinion to previous 2D Zeldas? And if you're a fan of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's approach, I'd be especially interested in hearing how you think this game compares to them. Tell me about it in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more Zelda content from me in the future, because I don't get to talk about this series as much as I'd like. Thanks for watching. Au revoir!